the largest nuclear power station in British history, is being built right now on the coast of Somerset. Concrete by the hundreds of thousands of cubic meters, cooling tunnels punched deep beneath the seabed, 20,000 workers at peak, and a piece of it, a real signed, legally binding piece, belongs to China. Sit with that for a second. Don't scroll past it, sit with it. Britain, the country that switched on the world's very first commercial nuclear power station back in 1956 at Calder Hall. The country that, for all practical purposes, opened the civilian nuclear age for the entire planet. That Britain. And in the 2000s, when it set out to build the biggest reactor project it had attempted in a generation, it ran headfirst into something almost too uncomfortable to say out loud. It could not do it alone. It needed France for the engineering, and it needed China for the money. Roughly £6 billion of Chinese state capital poured straight into the foundations of Britain's single most important energy project of the century. How does that happen? How does the birthplace of nuclear power end up, decades later, holding out a hand to Beijing just to keep its own lights on? That is the story, and it is one of the strangest, most quietly revealing infrastructure stories in all of modern Europe. A story about what happens to a country that slowly, almost without noticing, forgets how to build the very thing it invented. Stick with me all the way to the end, because the way this deal was actually structured tells you more about real global power right now than almost anything you'll read in the headlines. And if you like infrastructure stories where the stakes are real and nobody's pretending the world is simpler than it is, hit subscribe. Because this is exactly the kind of story I pull apart, thread by thread, start to finish. Here's the part that genuinely sounds made up. Britain did not sleepwalk into this. It did not get tricked, ambushed, or out-negotiated by some shadowy plan it never saw coming. It walked in with its eyes wide open, because every single other option on the table was worse. The alternative here was not wounded national pride. The alternative was the lights flickering off across a G7 economy. Let me show you the trap, because Britain built this trap for itself, brick by brick, decision by decision, across 40 years. For decades, the UK ran on three things: coal, gas, and nuclear. Simple, reliable, boring in the very best possible way. The nuclear plants got built between the late 1960s and the 1980s. Places like Hunterston, Dungeness B, a whole fleet of advanced gas-cooled reactor stations scattered across the country, and they just worked. Year after year after year, they fed steady, uncomplaining electricity into the grid and asked for almost nothing in return except maintenance and time. But here is the one fact about a reactor that governs this entire story. It does not last forever. And by the 2000s, almost all of them were hitting the wall at once. Read that again, slowly, at once. The entire backbone of British nuclear power was aging into retirement on roughly the same schedule, like a generation of workers all reaching 65 in the same handful of years. And it didn't stop there. Coal plants were being switched off to meet climate targets. And gas? Gas prices were lurching violently all over the place, especially after global supply shocks rattled the whole market and reminded everyone how exposed they really were. So picture the spreadsheet a British energy planner was actually staring at. Inside a single decade, one decade, a massive chunk of the country's most dependable power was scheduled to go dark. And there was nothing of the right size, nothing of the right reliability lined up to take its place. And you cannot run a country on hope. Homes need power, railways need power, factories, hospitals, and now sprawling data centers. They all need electricity that is simply there at 3 o'clock in the morning in the dead of February, when the wind isn't blowing and the sun went down 9 hours ago, and nobody cares about your climate slideshow because they just want the heating to work. That's the part that gets quietly skipped in most energy conversations. Wind and solar are genuinely, enormously valuable. When the weather cooperates, nuclear doesn't care about the weather. It doesn't care if it's calm or cloudy or pitch black at midnight. It just runs. And here is the scale that makes nuclear different in kind, not merely in degree. One single large reactor can outproduce hundreds of wind turbines, around the clock, no gaps, no excuses, no waiting for a gust. So when Britain looked around for something, anything, to plug the hole left by its dying reactors, it kept landing on the same uncomfortable answer: more nuclear. So Britain made its move, a brand new nuclear station at Hinkley Point C on the Somerset coast. And let me be absolutely clear about what this was, because it's easy to underestimate. This was not a tune-up of some tired old facility. This was not bolting a shiny new wing onto an existing plant and calling it progress. This was one of the largest energy projects ever attempted on the entire European continent. From scratch, on a quiet, windswept stretch of coastline where, not long before, there had been almost nothing. Here's where the numbers start to get genuinely insane. Hinkley Point C runs 2 European pressurized reactors. Each one is rated at about 1.6 gigawatts. Put the two of them together and you get 3.2 gigawatts of electricity, enough to power around 6 million homes. That is roughly 7% of the entire United Kingdom's electricity grid, coming out of one site, 2 reactors, 1 patch of Somerset coast. Let that land for a moment because it's a strange thing to actually hold in your head. 7% of a major industrial nation's electricity generated at a single facility. Now compare it to everything else Britain has got. A large offshore wind farm in British waters might hit 1 gigawatt at peak output. And don't get me wrong, that's a serious, genuinely impressive piece of engineering. But at peak is doing an enormous amount of quiet work in that sentence, because wind depends entirely, completely on the weather. Hinkley Point C, by contrast, is built to run almost constantly for about 60 years. 60 years. That relentless, unglamorous, never stops, never blinks power is precisely what Britain is losing as the old stations switch off one by one. And that's the whole point. And the construction site itself tells you the scale better than any statistic on a slide. Engineers poured hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of concrete just into the reactor foundations, just the foundations. Before you even get to the actual buildings, they dug cooling tunnels deep beneath the seabed, carving channels into the ground under the ocean. At the peak of construction, more than 20,000 workers were expected on site, an entire temporary city of hard hats and cranes, turning a sleepy corner of the English coast into one of the single biggest construction zones anywhere in Europe. But here is the kicker. Here is the thing that cracked this entire project wide open and dragged 2 foreign governments straight into the heart of Britain's power supply. Cost. The early estimates came in around £18 billion. Enormous, yes, but, on paper, manageable. Then the projections climbed past £30 billion. Then the delays shoved them higher still. And that makes Hinkley Point C one of the most expensive power stations ever built anywhere on planet Earth. Not one of the most expensive in Britain, on Earth. And this is the part the rest of the West should have been studying very, very closely, because Britain was not alone in this pain. Not even close. This was a Western disease, and it had been spreading for years. Look at Finland. The Olkiluoto nuclear power plant took more than 15 years to build and cost over $11 billion. 15 years. Think about that. A child born when that project started would be most of the way through school by the time it finished. Look at France's own Flamanville plant. Same grim story, the same crippling delays, the same enormous cost overruns stacking up year after year. So when private investors looked at the state of modern Western nuclear, they saw one thing and one thing only: risk. A money pit with a 15-year fuse and absolutely no guarantee of when, or even whether, it would ever pay off. And British companies? They simply did not have the cash. And worse, far worse, they did not have the recent experience. The country hadn't built a nuclear plant from the ground up in decades. The supply chains had shriveled. The skilled workers, the specialist welders, the nuclear engineers, the people who actually know in their hands how to pour a reactor and make it safe, had drifted off into entirely other industries years before. Britain still had the regulators. Britain still had the brains and the universities. What Britain had quietly lost was the muscle memory of building. So the UK government went looking for a partner who had 2 things at once: the money and the proven, recent, hands-on ability to actually pour a reactor and get the thing running. And that single decision, that one search for a partner who could do what Britain no longer could, is what cracked the door open. First for France, and then, following right in behind, for China. France came first. EDF, Électricité de France, runs most of the entire French nuclear fleet. And here's a number that quietly reframes this whole story. France generates about 70% of its electricity from nuclear power. 70%, one of the highest shares of any nation on Earth. These are people who, unlike the British, simply never forgot how to build. EDF already operated several existing nuclear stations on British soil, including Sizewell B and older plants now creeping toward retirement themselves. So when the UK went hunting for a builder, EDF wasn't merely an option. It was the obvious choice, almost the only choice. EDF agreed to lead the Hinkley Point C project and take the largest ownership share. It brought reactor design expertise, hardened project management teams, and decades of real operating experience. Britain, in return, would provide the site, the regulation, and the long-term electricity contracts that make a project this enormous financially survivable in the first place. But, and here's the twist almost nobody saw coming from the outside, EDF had its own serious problems. Big ones, deep ones. Because at the exact same moment EDF was signing up to lead Hinkley, it was already neck-deep in those nightmare builds. Olkiluoto in Finland, Flamanville in France, both running catastrophically late, both bleeding money by the month, and all of that financial bleeding piled straight onto EDF's own books. The company was carrying enormous debt and desperately needed partners to help share the staggering risk. So follow the logic of exactly where we've arrived. Britain needs new nuclear power urgently. France has the engineering experience, but not enough spare cash to absorb all that risk alone. And there's a hole in the budget the size of a small country, sitting there, unfilled. And somebody was standing right there, ready, patient, cash in hand, China. Because while the entire West was stuck in its expensive, delayed, over-budget nuclear slump, China was on an absolute tear. It had thrown up dozens of reactors at home in a remarkably short span of time, while the West argued and overran and apologized. It had state-backed companies sitting on enormous cash reserves. And maybe most importantly of all, it wanted something that money can't directly buy. It wanted to prove to the entire world that its nuclear industry could compete at the very top of the game. So in 2015, Britain signed the deal. It brought in China General Nuclear Power Group as a major investor in Hinkley Point C. Here's exactly how the ownership broke down. EDF would own about 2/3 of the project. China General Nuclear would own about 1/3, and China's share was worth roughly £6 billion. That money is a huge part of what made the entire thing financially possible in the first place. Without it, the math may simply not have closed. And this deal did not fall out of a clear blue sky. At that precise moment, Britain and China were drawing closer than they had in living memory. British leaders were openly, proudly calling it a golden era of cooperation. Chinese companies were pouring money into British real estate, into rail projects, into energy systems right across the country. Britain wanted that foreign capital badly. It wanted to build enormous infrastructure without slapping on tax hikes or piling up government debt too quickly. Foreign money looked like a way to get the things it needed without anyone at home having to pay the bill up front. So from London's point of view, the logic was almost elegant in its simplicity. We need the power. France has the engineering, China has the funding. Put all three of those together, and we build a plant that none of us could ever have built alone. But here's what I really need you to understand. Because from Beijing's point of view, this deal was worth far more than just its money back. China did not write a £6 billion check simply to collect steady, modest returns over the next 60 years. That was the boring surface of it, the part you'd put in a press release. Underneath it was strategy. Long, patient, deliberate, generational strategy. China wanted something you cannot purchase with cash alone, no matter how much of it you have. It wanted its own nuclear technology accepted in Western markets. By the time of this deal, China had already built more than 30 reactors at home, with dozens more under construction at the same time. And it had developed its very own reactor design, called the Hualong-1, which combined French, American, and Chinese engineering features into a single standardized reactor that China fully intended to export across the entire world. But here's the brutal catch when it comes to selling reactors. Nobody buys one off a shelf. A nuclear reactor is not a train. It is not a bridge. No country on Earth will buy one unless it has passed strict, punishing, unforgiving safety reviews. And approval from a country like Britain carries colossal weight because the UK runs one of the most demanding nuclear regulators anywhere in the world. A British safety stamp is, in effect, a global passport. Pass there and doors open everywhere. So China proposed a three-step plan, and once you see it laid out plainly, it's almost surgical in its precision. Step 1. Invest in Hinkley Point C right alongside EDF. Get inside the British system, learn exactly how it works from within, not from the outside, and prove, project by project, that China can operate cleanly under demanding Western safety rules. Step 2. Move on to another project, and this time take a far larger role. The site lined up for exactly this was Bradwell-on-Sea in Essex. And at Bradwell, China didn't want to be a quiet minority investor in the corner. At Bradwell, China wanted to build its own Hualong 1 reactor design on British soil with its own technology at the center. Step 3. Once that Chinese reactor passed British safety approval, China could turn around and market that exact same design across Europe, across Africa, across the Middle East. Because a reactor that has been certified safe enough for Britain is a reactor that suddenly earns trust almost everywhere else on the map. Does that pattern sound familiar to you? It should, because it is almost identical to what China had already pulled off with high-speed rail. Build the network at home first, fast and at massive scale. Then partner abroad to prove it travels. Then export a single standardized design to the entire world. From China's point of view, Hinkley Point C was never really just an investment in a power plant. It was a doorway into the global nuclear market. And then the door started to swing shut, because tensions between China and the West were climbing fast, over trade, over technology, over national security, all of it at once, all tangled together. And the moment you'll probably remember most clearly, Britain pulling Huawei equipment out of its 5G telecom networks over security concerns. That one decision set off a far wider review of Chinese investment right across British infrastructure. And nuclear shot straight to the very front of that review. Critics started saying the quiet part out loud. Allowing a Chinese state company deep into a nuclear project, a project that, remember, will run for 60 years, could create long-term dependence. The kind of dependence you can't easily walk back once it's literally set in concrete. And as that political pressure mounted, Britain began to seriously, urgently rethink its entire nuclear future with China. The first target was the next project in line, Bradwell, the very place where China was supposed to build its own reactor and finally earn that Golden Western certificate. And here's how genuinely different Bradwell was from what came before. At Hinkley Point C, France's EDF led the construction, and China sat in the minority investor's seat. At Bradwell, China wanted the larger role, with its own reactor design sitting right at the center of everything. Britain's nuclear regulator would review that design, and if it passed, China would have its first Western-certified reactor in hand, the prize it had been building toward this whole time. But Bradwell quickly ran into trouble. The safety review process slowed down. Investors grew uncertain and nervous. The UK government started openly eyeing entirely different funding options for its future plants. And eventually, Bradwell drifted into a long, quiet, indefinite pause. China remained a partner at Hinkley Point C, but its chances of ever building its own reactor in Britain shrank, and then shrank some more. And that's the lesson buried deep in all this concrete. Nuclear plants are built to run for 60 years. But international relations can flip in just a few. You can sign a deal in the very middle of a so-called golden era, and watch the gold begin to tarnish before the foundations have even finished curing. Now, I want to be completely straight with you here, because this is the exact point where I flatly refuse to do what the loud, lazy channels do and pretend this is a clean, simple villain story with a hero and a bad guy. It isn't. It really isn't. This is not the tale of an unstoppable China outplaying a helpless, hapless West. Britain went into this with its eyes fully open and with real, genuine leverage. It is the one holding the regulator, the site, and the long-term contracts that make or break the whole thing. China's role at Hinkley is a minority stake. It is not control of the plant. And the reactor technology itself is European. Hinkley is EDF-led, built around French reactor design, not Chinese design. On top of that, the West's nuclear struggles are, frankly, largely self-inflicted wounds. Olkiluoto and Flamanville prove, beyond much argument, that the cost and delay catastrophe is a Western industry problem first and foremost, not evidence of some Chinese magic touch that nobody can match. China's reactors carry their own open questions and unknowns. And, approved in Britain, was a finish line Beijing, in the end, never actually got to cross. And the costs are real and ugly across the entire board. Hinkley's price tag swelling past £30 billion is the whole reason this deal happened in the first place. That number is a warning, it is not a trophy. Nobody, not Britain, not France, not China, walks away from this story with a clean, total, uncomplicated win. What you are really watching here is a country making a genuinely hard trade-off under genuine grinding pressure. But the trade-off is still happening. Right now. Today. As you watch this. Construction at Hinkley Point C is still grinding forward. Over budget, behind schedule, but moving. When Britain first approved the plant, the first reactor was expected to start operating in 2025. Later updates pushed that timeline well into the 2030s. And large nuclear projects almost always slam into exactly this wall because they involve thousands upon thousands of individual components, brutal and repeated safety checks, and almost impossibly complex construction buried inside reinforced concrete structures. But the work doesn't stop. It can't stop, because Britain still needs the electricity. The old reactors keep closing, one after another, on schedule, and something, somewhere, has to replace them. And China? Still an investor through China General Nuclear Power Group, even after Britain went on to block Chinese participation in newer projects like Sizewell C. The partnership at Hinkley survives for the most ordinary, unglamorous reason in the entire world. The contracts were already signed and the construction had already started. You can reverse your politics overnight with a single announcement. You cannot unpour a foundation. So here is the future, already half built into the Somerset coast, hardening into permanence a little more every single day. A nation that invented commercial nuclear power, now quietly buying its way back into the game with foreign money it could no longer raise at home. The world's most demanding nuclear regulator, sitting on top of a flagship national project part owned by the very country it would later decide it didn't fully trust. The whole tangled, contradictory bargain, fixed in steel and concrete, locked in for 60 years, far too late and far too expensive to undo. Which leaves you with the one question I genuinely cannot answer for you. Only you can. If foreign money is the only way to build the thing your country desperately, urgently needs, do you take the deal, strings and all, and live with whoever holds the other end? Or do you pay more, wait longer, swallow the cost, and keep full control at home? Tell me where you land down in the comments. I actually read them. And if you want more stories like this, where the infrastructure is real and the stakes are far bigger than anyone in charge wants to admit out loud, subscribe, because the next one is already taking shape.